So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. That line is from a video essay published in 2021 about Star Wars. In 2025, it hits different. Padmé Amidala delivers it in the Senate chamber of the Galactic Republic while watching a standing ovation greet the formal end of democracy. George Lucas wrote it for a 2005 space opera. 4 years on from that essay, the gap between metaphor and description has been closing steadily, and right now, it's almost gone. Lucas wasn't guessing when he wrote it. He had been studying this specific question since 1971, the year he began developing what would become Star Wars, while processing his opposition to Nixon's presidency and the Vietnam War. His foundational question, articulated most directly in a 2005 Chicago Tribune interview: how do democracies get turned into dictatorships? Because the democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. He was 27 when he started building his answer. It took him 30 years and 6 films to deliver it. The documented sources for Palpatine aren't guesswork or retrospective interpretation. In a July 1981 story conference, 18 years before The Phantom Menace opened in theaters, Lucas sat down with director Richard Marquand, screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan, and producer Howard Kazanjian to work through the Return of the Jedi script. The conference documentation establishes the Nixon parallel explicitly. Then, shortly before Return of the Jedi's release in 1983, Lucas was asked whether Palpatine was ever a Jedi. His answer? No, he was a politician. Richard M. Nixon was his name. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and became an imperial guy, and he was really evil. But he pretended to be a really nice guy. Nixon as Palpatine's primary model predates the prequel trilogy by nearly 2 decades. The parallel was the foundation, not a footnote. By the time the prequels were in production, Lucas had expanded the historical reference set. He drew explicitly from the documented behaviors of Adolf Hitler and Julius Caesar, both confirmed in academic analysis of his stated intentions. Hitler was handed the German chancellorship in January 1933 by establishment conservatives who calculated they could control him, then watched him use emergency legislation to dismantle every constitutional constraint they'd relied on across the following 2 months. Caesar held elected Roman power far beyond its prescribed term through continuous military emergency, each extension of his command justified by a conflict that never quite resolved into peace, a structural detail Lucas imported directly into Palpatine's use of the Clone Wars as a self-perpetuating mandate for expanded authority. When Lucas designed the Galactic Republic's political architecture, he modeled it on American democracy, which the Founding Fathers had deliberately modeled on Rome. 3 civilizations wired in series inside a single political warning, delivered in lightsaber language to an audience that memorized the theme song before they understood what they were being taught. Producer Rick McCallum, speaking to the Chicago Tribune in 2005. We never thought of Bush ever becoming president, or then 9/11, the Patriot Act, war, weapons of mass destruction. Then suddenly you realize, oh my God, there's something happening that looks like we're almost prescient. Lucas himself, in that same period. I love history, so while the psychological basis of Star Wars is mythological, the political and social bases are historical. At Cannes, where Revenge of the Sith premiered in May 2005, the political readings from festival audiences were blunt enough that CBS News documented them in its coverage. Audiences connecting the film's arc of democratic collapse to the post-9/11 Bush administration without prompting from the filmmakers. Lucas noted publicly that his work had been colored by his observations of the Nixon administration, and more recently, the Bush administration's post-9/11 trajectory. Prescient was the word people kept reaching for. Prescience implies accident. Lucas was working from documented history, named sources, and 30 years of deliberate structural analysis. He was a political scientist who had worked out that the most durable delivery mechanism for a warning isn't a policy paper or an editorial. It's a story about fathers and sons and redemption, wrapped in the most beloved fictional mythology a generation would ever have. The mechanism he encoded begins not with violence, but with a commercial dispute. In the Phantom Menace, the Trade Federation imposes a blockade on Naboo, framed publicly as a response to the taxation of trade routes in outlying systems, a business conflict that has escalated into a military standoff. The Galactic Senate debates the legality of the blockade in Procedural Committee, while Newt Gunray, Trade Federation Viceroy, waits on his orbiting command ship for instructions. Those instructions come from Darth Sidious, who is simultaneously Senator Palpatine of Naboo, the elected representative of the planet being blockaded, issuing the orders for its invasion from both positions at once. Canonically, Sidious ordered Gunray to deploy forces to Naboo's surface and execute Queen Amidala once she was captured. He manufactured the emergency that made him the victim of it, arranged the crisis that would propel him to the chancellorship, and then positioned himself as the statesman capable of resolving it. This is the first step in Lucas's political playbook, a genuine-looking emergency, created or channeled by the candidate it benefits, arriving at a moment when the existing institutional response is too slow or too compromised to address it before the political damage is done. The Trade Federation blockade works not because it's dramatic, but because it's procedurally unanswerable. The Senate debates jurisdiction while people on Naboo are dying, and every day of Senate deliberation is another day Chancellor Valorum looks ineffectual. Valorum is the incumbent. He's not corrupt. He's constitutionally scrupulous in ways that produce paralysis when emergency conditions demand visible, decisive action. He is the moderate institutional leader who becomes a political liability precisely in the environment engineered to make moderation look like inadequacy. The Reichstag burned on February 27, 1933. Within 24 hours, Hitler invoked Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution to issue the Reichstag Fire Decree, suspending civil liberties provisions indefinitely as a security emergency. Whether the Nazis set the fire or simply exploited it, the historical record remains contested. The political mechanics were identical either way. Emergency creates the window. The window justifies the policy. The policy generates institutional facts on the ground before deliberative processes can respond. By the time anyone could examine what had actually happened, the examination took place inside a restructured legal environment. Naomi Klein mapped this as a recurring technology of political transformation in The Shock Doctrine, published in 2007. Manufactured or exploited crises enable policy captures that would be politically impossible under normal democratic conditions. The shock arrives first. The restructuring follows. Emergency periods are when the most irreversible structural changes happen fastest, because emergency conditions suppress the friction that normally limits the speed of institutional transformation. Palpatine used it with the precision of someone who had studied it across centuries. The Trade Federation crisis wasn't merely a power play. It was an education in what a well-timed emergency could accomplish. He spent the next decade refining the method. Queen Amidala escapes the blockade, reaches Coruscant, addresses the Senate in person. Palpatine, the sorrowful senator from the invaded planet, offers tactical advice. Bring the matter to the Senate floor and call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. This is constitutionally legitimate. There is a genuine crisis. Valorum has genuinely failed to act. Amidala makes the motion, not because Palpatine coerced her, but because he framed the political situation accurately enough that the motion felt like her own idea, arriving at the only sensible conclusion. The Senate votes. Valorum is removed. Palpatine, the candidate from the crisis world, receives sympathy nominations from across the chamber and is confirmed as Supreme Chancellor. He received a democratic mandate. The mandate was built on a crisis he engineered. Every procedural step between the Trade Federation blockade and the chancellorship was legitimate. The outcome was designed. A title, however, operates within constitutional limits. Chancellors can be investigated, voted out, politically outmaneuvered. Palpatine needed more than a position. He needed a war, and specifically one he could command from both sides. Count Dooku's public biography was credible on its own terms. He had been a Jedi Master, a student of Yoda, a principled intellectual voice before his departure from the Order. When he resurfaced as the founding leader of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the separatist movement, representing thousands of planetary systems that had formally withdrawn from the Republic. His critique of galactic governance had real substance. The Senate was gridlocked. The banking clan and the Trade Federation held disproportionate legislative influence. The Republic's tax structure and trade regulations consistently disadvantaged outlying systems. Dooku gave those grievances a face, a philosophy, and apparent moral seriousness. Systems defected to the Confederacy because his arguments couldn't be easily dismissed. Dooku was also Darth Tyrannus, Palpatine's Sith apprentice, recruited to the dark side before the events of the Phantom Menace. His leadership of the separatist movement was an operation Palpatine designed, funded through the banking clan and Trade Federation networks, and directed through the command chain Dooku reported up. Palpatine served simultaneously as Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic and, through Dooku, as the de facto strategic commander of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The Clone Wars, 3 years of galactic conflict across hundreds of planetary systems, the central organizing catastrophe of the prequel era, was designed, initiated, and directed by one person sitting in both command chairs. He held both sets of battle plans. He knew every Republic vulnerability because he was the Republic's supreme executive. He knew every separatist contingency because his apprentice commanded the separatist military. This made the Clone Wars self-sustaining as a political mechanism. A war Palpatine controlled from both sides could never accidentally be won before he was ready. Losing either side meant losing one of his own instruments. The conflict needed to continue at sufficient intensity to justify emergency powers, emergency deployments, and emergency authority expansions, while never escalating to a resolution that would end the emergency it was generating. 3 years of productive military stalemate, maintained by an architect who wrote both sets of orders. When Dooku's function as controlled opposition was complete, specifically when Palpatine needed Anakin Skywalker to commit an act of unsanctioned execution that would bind him irrevocably to the Sith, Dooku became expendable. Anakin kills him aboard the Invisible Hand at the opening of Revenge of the Sith, at Palpatine's explicit instruction. The tool's function was finished. It was discarded with the efficiency of someone who had been planning that moment since recruitment. The practical parallel to genuine dual command at Palpatine's strategic level is rare enough in documented history that the real-world mapping requires focusing on the underlying mechanism rather than a direct case match. The Patriot Act passed the United States Senate 98-1 on October 25, 2001, 45 days after the September 11th attacks, expanding federal surveillance authority that would have required years of normal legislative process under any other conditions. The emergency compressed the window between proposal and passage to 6 weeks, which is a version of the same dynamic that Palpatine's manufactured war produced, running through genuine crisis rather than orchestrated conflict, but producing the identical institutional result. Emergency conditions enable authority expansions that couldn't survive peacetime deliberation. On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump signed Proclamation 10,886, declaring a national emergency at the southern border, explicitly framed as requiring use of the armed forces. The same day, he signed a separate executive order declaring a national energy emergency. Within the administration's first weeks in office, 9 new national emergency declarations had been issued. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, originally designed for narrow national security applications, was invoked to impose broad trade tariffs through emergency declaration, bypassing the constitutional provision assigning Congress authority over trade policy. An executive order asserted direct presidential control over independent federal regulatory agencies, bodies specifically constructed to operate outside partisan executive influence, because concentrated presidential authority over administrative functions had been recognized as structurally dangerous in earlier constitutional jurisprudence. Trump signed more executive orders in 2025 than across his entire first term. 1/3 of them were challenged in court. Courts responded. Sanctuary city orders were blocked. The reviewing mechanisms functioned as designed. But 9 emergency declarations, even with a third blocked by courts, still represent 6 separate exercises of emergency authority initiated before any reviewing body could deliberate about whether the emergency justified them. A plan that only works perfectly is more fragile than one that works well enough when challenged. The clumsiness visible in the 1/3 court challenge rate isn't a safeguard. Back to the Galactic Senate. Year 22 BBY. A procedural vote that demonstrates the exact geometry of Lucas's warning most precisely. The separatist threat has become publicly visible. Star systems are defecting. Count Dooku has delivered speeches about the Republic's corruption. Genuine political support exists in the Senate for a Military Creation Act, establishing a Republic army to counter the separatist buildup. Chancellor Palpatine, constitutionally prohibited from requesting this directly, waits. Senator Padmé Amidala, a leading voice against military expansion, is away from Coruscant on security grounds following a bombing of her ship. In her absence, the Gungan representative Jar Jar Binks serves as acting senator for Naboo. Jar Jar makes the motion granting Palpatine emergency powers, enabling him to raise a grand army of the Republic without a full Senate vote. He does this because the Republic is genuinely at war, because the situation genuinely appears to require decisive executive action, and because he trusts the Chancellor he has known since the events on Naboo. He isn't being manipulated in a manner visible to him. He is doing exactly what a reasonable Democratic representative might do under identical circumstances. A sincere participant in a constitutional process, operating without access to the information that would tell him how this moment has been positioned to arrive. In the Senate chamber, Palpatine stands to receive the emergency powers grant with theatrical reluctance. His address to the chamber includes the declaration that he loves democracy and loves the Republic. The Senate applauds. The powers are granted with a promise they will be relinquished once the crisis resolves. The crisis, which Palpatine is directing from both sides, will resolve exactly when he decides it should. The Reichstag, what remained of it, voted on the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933. The session took place in the Kroll Opera House because the actual Reichstag building was still damaged from the February fire. The Social Democrats voted against. Their leader, Otto Wels, delivered a speech that was accurate about what was happening and changed nothing. The Center Party voted for it. Conservative nationalists voted for it. The communists had already been arrested or expelled. With 441 votes in favor and 84 against, the Reichstag surrendered its own legislative authority for 4 years, legally, constitutionally, through a valid democratic process, in a single afternoon. The Weimar Republic, built on one of the most sophisticated democratic constitutions drafted to that point, was dissolved by its own parliament through legitimate procedure. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in How Democracies Die, published in 2018, identified this as the primary mechanism of contemporary democratic failure. Legal backsliding, institutions endorsing their own erosion through procedural compliance, each individual decision defensible in isolation, the cumulative trajectory catastrophic, and often irreversible by the time it becomes visible. Their academic framework arrived 13 years after Revenge of the Sith mapped the identical process in cinematic form, with a Senate full of representatives doing their reasonable best in a situation specifically engineered to produce a fatal result. Palpatine now had the chancellorship, the emergency powers, and the army. He needed one final thing before the endgame. The conspiracy embedded inside every clone trooper's skull had to remain invisible until the exact moment he needed to fire it. In the 501st Legion, clone trooper CT-5385, call sign TUP, begins behaving strangely during the Battle of Ringo Vinda. The Ringo Vinda campaign is grinding, high casualty, fought on a space station encircling a star, one of dozens of simultaneous engagements across the Outer Rim. Tup has fought in multiple campaigns before this one. He has squad mates who know him. He has a name, which matters in the Clone Wars, specifically because Dave Filoni's production team gave clone troopers names and personalities deliberately, to give the audience enough investment in their humanity to feel the full weight of what the chips represent. At Ringo Vinda, something breaks inside Tup's skull. The behavioral modification biochip embedded in his brain, standard installation in every clone trooper since their creation on Kamino, a fact none of them know, for purposes none of them have been told, malfunctions. Tup's eyes go flat. He walks across the battlefield and shoots Jedi General Tiplar through the head at close range, mid-engagement, for no reason any soldier standing next to him can process. He is captured and sedated. His squadmate, CT-27-5555, callsign Fives, is an ARC trooper, Advanced Recon Commando, Elite Infantry. He has served since the Battle of Geonosis, which is year 22 BBY, the opening engagement of the Clone Wars, which means Fives has been fighting for approximately 3 years at the point the Ringo Vinda incident occurs. He has survived the Citadel mission, he has fought in campaigns across multiple sectors, and he has been fighting alongside Tup long enough to know the difference between a breakdown and whatever just happened on that platform. Tup's eyes at the moment of the shooting contained nothing. The act had no emotional signature. Fives has seen soldiers break under combat stress. This wasn't that. Fives accompanies Tup back to Kamino for examination. Working with a medical droid designated AZI-3, he begins an unauthorized parallel investigation alongside the official Kaminoan inquiry. He locates the chip in Tup's brain, small, organic-looking, positioned near the base of the skull, in tissue not typically accessed in standard clone trooper medical protocols. He identifies it as a behavioral modification biochip. Then he finds the scope of it. Every clone trooper produced on Kamino carries an identical device. Every one of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers deployed across the galaxy, fighting alongside Jedi officers for 3 years, carries a neural override in their central nervous system that the Jedi don't know about, and the clones themselves were never told existed. When Fives presses the Kaminoan team on who authorized the chip's installation, the answer he receives is precise and strategically damaging. The Jedi ordered them. Medical records apparently confirm it. The Jedi Council authorized the chips as a behavioral safeguard against potential clone irregularity. Fives is standing inside a military institution he has served with total loyalty, and receiving documentation that the people he has been fighting beside ordered a secret neural override installed in his brain without his knowledge or consent. This detail matters beyond its immediate plot function. Palpatine built his cover story with institutional credibility. Rather than denying the chips existed, he pointed the investigation at the Jedi as the explanation for why they existed. The architecture of the cover-up and the architecture of the massacre share identical framing. Order 66 itself will be justified as a response to Jedi treason. The chips are framed as protection against the Jedi, and the chips are what will be used to kill them. Palpatine embedded his justification for the genocide inside the investigation trying to expose it. Fives doesn't accept the Kaminoan explanation. He has AZI-3 remove the chip from his own brain. He survives. He now has physical evidence, a chip extracted from a living trooper's skull. The Kaminoan technical documentation AZI-3 helped him compile, and his own neurological baseline to demonstrate that removing the device doesn't destroy function. He has everything required to blow the operation open. Nala Se, Kamino's chief medical scientist and the architect of the chip program's cover, reports Fives' investigation to Palpatine's office. The political machinery moves before Fives reaches Coruscant. While Jedi Master Shak Ti, assigned to oversee the examination, is attending to other business, Nala Se injects Fives with a psychosis-inducing compound. The drug is undetectable in the situation that follows. When Fives escapes from Kamino and reaches the capital, he is a desperate, increasingly incoherent soldier, behaving with mounting erraticism, a symptom of the compound already running in his system, carrying claims about a galaxy-spanning conspiracy embedded in the nervous systems of every clone trooper. He reaches Captain Rex and Anakin Skywalker. These are the two people in the Grand Army of the Republic with the closest personal relationships to both Palpatine and the Jedi Council. Simultaneously, the most important and the most compromised possible recipients of this information. Fives presses his case. He has the chip. He has the technical data. He is correct in every particular about what the devices are, what they're designed to execute, and who benefits from their existence. Palpatine grants Fives a private audience. That meeting does not play on screen. Dave Filoni made the deliberate choice to leave the room opaque, which amplifies rather than diminishes its weight. What plays on screen is the result. Fives emerging from the meeting in acute psychological deterioration, the compound now fully active. Palpatine's staff reporting that the clone trooper attacked the Chancellor. Clone Commander Fox responds to the situation he has been given. Fox is a soldier doing his job inside a scenario that has been precisely engineered to produce a lethal outcome. He shoots Fives. Rex and Anakin hold Fives as he dies on a landing platform on Coruscant. His final words, per the Wikipedia account of the episode, were that the mission and his nightmares were finally over. Rex files a confidential report documenting Fives' suspicions about the inhibitor chips, the nature of what Fives found on Kamino, and the implications for Order 66. The report is classified and effectively buried. Anakin, who heard everything from Fives directly, can't integrate the information, partly because Fives' behavior in his final hours fit the profile of a paranoid breakdown rather than a credible intelligence disclosure, partly because Palpatine had spent years carefully cultivating Anakin's emotional dependency, positioning himself as the Chancellor who trusted Anakin when the Jedi Council expressed doubts, manufacturing a dynamic in which Anakin's institutional loyalties and his personal bond with Palpatine ran in directly opposite directions. The thread Fives handed Anakin led straight to Palpatine. Anakin didn't pull it. Years later, chronologically after Revenge of the Sith, Ahsoka Tano uses the information that survived in Rex's memory to remove Rex's chip before Order 66's command reaches it. Fives' research saved Rex's life. The man who did the research died on a landing platform, trying to make anyone act on it before the window closed. The structure of Fives' failure is the structure of every whistleblower silenced inside a system pre-compromised at every level, capable of acting on the information. He found the truth completely. He reached the right people, the two men in the Grand Army with the most direct access to both Palpatine and the Jedi Council. He had physical evidence removed from his own skull. He pressed his case under conditions already designed to prevent it from landing. The psychosis compound didn't fabricate incoherence from nothing. It amplified the genuine desperation of someone who understood exactly what Order 66 would mean, and couldn't make the people in front of him hear it in time. The drug met the desperation halfway, and produced a picture indistinguishable from instability. Palpatine neutralized Fives in real time, without raising his voice, without breaking his public persona, without leaving visible fingerprints on the mechanism. He understood that suppressing a whistleblower most effectively means ensuring they discredit themselves, or appear to, before their information reaches a reviewing body with structural capacity to act. Fives' information was existential. The window for it to matter was measured in hours. Palpatine had been positioning mechanisms to close that window for years before Fives found the chips. Order 66 executed successfully. Every clone trooper on every battlefield in the galaxy simultaneously turned on the Jedi they had fought beside for 3 years. Mace Windu's escort on Megiddo, Ki-Adi-Mundi on Megiddo, Plo Koon above Cato Nemoidia, Aayla Secura on Felucia. Across 100 worlds at once, soldiers who had learned the Jedi's fighting styles, who had watched their officers grieve and make jokes and sacrifice themselves, raised their weapons and fired. The 3 years of the Clone Wars had been generating clone Jedi loyalty in parallel with the chips waiting inside that loyalty for 20. The war did exactly what a war run from inside both command structures needed to do. It produced the conditions that made Order 66 look like betrayal rather than programming. By the time Revenge of the Sith opens its third act, the architecture is complete. Dooku is dead, killed by Anakin at Palpatine's instruction aboard the Invisible Hand. General Grievous is dead. The Separatist leadership is being executed on Mustafar by Darth Vader, who was Anakin Skywalker 24 hours earlier. The Clone Wars ended the same way it started, from inside both command structures, by the same architect, with no one able to see the full shape until it was already finished. In the Galactic Senate, Palpatine stands at the podium and delivers the address. The Jedi, he tells the assembled representatives of thousands of worlds, have attempted a treasonous coup against the Republic. They have operated in secret, accumulated unauthorized influence, and moved against the democratically elected government. The Republic has faced enemies without and enemies within, and the security of civilization requires a government proportionate to the threats arrayed against it. He pauses. He thanks the Senate for its endurance and its trust across this long emergency. Then, he announces the reorganization of the Galactic Republic into the First Galactic Empire, to be greeted by sustained peace and justice throughout the galaxy. The Senate stands. The applause begins and continues and grows. He never fired a weapon in that chamber. He received a democratic mandate for the formal end of democracy. Padmé Amidala, watching from the Senate floor, delivers the line, and the exact canonical wording carries precision. So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. The canonical line uses liberty, not democracy. That distinction may be more accurate than accidental. Democracy, as a procedure, was still technically operating in that chamber. The Senate voted. The motion passed. The process was constitutionally valid at every step. What the applause marked was the death of liberty, the actual freedom of actual people, across thousands of worlds, to live outside the terms the new government would set for them. Democratic forms can survive the evacuation of democratic content. The procedure runs on after the substance it was built to protect has already been destroyed, and the applause is the moment the content dies while everyone celebrates the form. The Weimar Enabling Act passed with 441 votes in favor on March 23, 1933. Through constitutional process, the Republic dissolved legally in an afternoon. The Roman Senate renewed Caesar's extraordinary military command across multiple successive votes, each justified by ongoing emergency, until the distinction between emergency authority and constitutional baseline ceased to exist in practice. Both collapses were procedurally correct at every step. Both produced permanent results from accumulated temporary concessions. The senators who voted for each of those measures weren't uniformly craven. They were people under varying combinations of genuine pressure, strategic miscalculation, and sincere belief that the alternatives were worse, making individually defensible decisions whose aggregate was catastrophic. The 2025 parallel runs along the same mechanism. Proclamation 10,886, signed January 20th. The National Energy Emergency, signed the same day. The IEEPA invoked for tariffs, bypassing congressional trade authority. The executive order asserting direct presidential control over independent federal regulatory agencies built specifically to operate outside partisan executive reach. Federal workforce attrition of 23% since January 2025. 9 new national emergency declarations in the administration's opening weeks. Courts responding. Orders blocked. 1/3 of total executive orders challenged. The review mechanisms functioning as designed. The Galactic Senate's review mechanisms functioned too. It debated. It passed security legislation. It raised procedural objections at multiple points across the Clone Wars period. The senators who voted for Palpatine's emergency powers grants weren't foolish or treacherous. They were people under real pressure, choosing stability. Levitsky and Ziblatt's central argument in How Democracies Die is that this is the standard failure mode. Not external conquest or military coup, but a chain of individually defensible legal decisions made under conditions that have been engineered, or in some cases simply exploited, to make the accumulating erosion invisible until the total becomes irreversible. Each concession justified by the current emergency, each emergency managed well enough to generate the next concession. The aggregate visible only in retrospect, or to someone watching the whole sequence from outside it. Lucas had been watching the whole sequence from outside it for 30 years. He watched Nixon manage the Vietnam War with executive authority expansions his predecessors would have found constitutionally unrecognizable. He watched the Patriot Act pass in 45 days, surveillance powers that would have required years of normal legislative process, compressed to 6 weeks by emergency pressure. He watched the infrastructure of executive emergency authority accumulate across administrations, each provision individually justified, the total never scrutinized as a complete architecture, because no single moment looked like the definitive moment of permanent change. He encoded that knowledge into the mythology of a generation in the most durable medium available to him. He made it beautiful, made it about fathers and sons and redemption and a mystical energy field binding the universe together, so it would survive intact into whatever political moment would next require it. He said explicitly, 2005, Boston Globe, that while Star Wars' psychological basis was mythological, its political and social bases were historical. He named Nixon in story conference documentation from 1981 and in a 1983 interview. He named Hitler and Caesar publicly. He said democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. And he built a mythology around that sentence so complete and so beloved that the people who absorbed it absorbed the warning, whether they processed it as political analysis or not. The specific horror his work keeps demonstrating is the one Padmé's line encodes most precisely. The warning's failure to prevent the outcome isn't a failure of the warning. The mechanism Lucas was documenting doesn't require anyone to miss the warning. It requires conditions that make the warning feel abstract until the sequence of individually reasonable decisions has already progressed past the point where it can be reversed by normal institutional response. The Galactic Senate had every piece of the argument available to it. Each emergency powers grant looked defensible. The total became visible only when Padmé said it out loud at the moment the total was complete. Fives had the chips in his hands, and the mechanism fully understood, and the right people standing in front of him. The system surrounding him had been pre-positioned, years in advance, to ensure the information died with him. Lucas spent 30 years studying how that positioning works, built his answer into the most visible mythology he could construct, named all his sources, explained his thesis in plain language across 3 decades of interviews, and said plainly, "Democracies are given away, not overthrown." The alarm he built was calibrated to reach everyone who absorbed the story. It did reach them. That isn't the same as the alarm being sufficient. Padmé's line isn't a lament delivered from outside the mechanism. It's an observation delivered from inside it, by a character who watched every step of the process and couldn't stop any of it. That's what makes it the most honest line in the films. It describes a collapse that was legible at every stage and irreversible at the final one. So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. Subscribe for more stories like this.